Tonight on the Donlon Report, why Texas Democrats fled the Capitol over new voting proposals. Is that the Democratic thing to do? I'll ask one Texas representative about his party's protest. And protesters in Miami take to the streets and highways over the Cuban government's silencing of its citizens. We're live in Miami with the latest. And you've heard of murder hornets. What about giant goldfish coming to a lake near you, perhaps? I'll speak with an expert on the growing goldies and why it's such a big problem. Also, why one CEO is calling out the billionaire space race. Didn't NASA make it to orbit 60 years ago? The Donlon Report starts right now. Good evening. We start with how a bill becomes a law, or in Texas, how it doesn't become a law. It's unusual, it's unconventional, and it involves lawmakers literally leaving the state so they don't have to vote. We're going to make this even easier than Schoolhouse Rock, the television cartoon many of us remember. We're going to jump right to the end where lawmakers get together for a vote and decide whether a bill should become a law. You remember it.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city.
So most of the Texas House Democrats have headed to the capital city, but not Austin. They boarded private jets to D.C. with bags packed and a rack of Miller Lite in tow in an effort to block a new election law in their home state. In other words, getting lawmakers together for a vote isn't possible because the Democrats skipped town. No quorum, no vote. They say that law would make it harder for Texans to vote. So instead, they're pushing Congress to pass a sweeping election law to create national standards for voting.
We also know that we are living right now on borrowed time in Texas, and we can't stay here indefinitely. Texas Democrats will use everything in our power to fight back. But we need Congress to act now.
So can they leave town? Yes, they just did. Is it legal? Not exactly. In fact, Texas Governor Greg Abbott is threatening to have the lawmakers arrested when they do eventually return. It's sort of a traveling filibuster. Lawmakers are skipping a special session, at least for now anyway. But Governor Abbott is vowing to keep trying with more sessions until the bill becomes a law. And that's where we start tonight with News Nation's Allison Harris in Washington, who's been following President Biden on this very issue as well. Allison?
Yeah, Joe, we'll get to the Texas Democrats here in D.C., but starting with the president today, also speaking very strongly on voting rights. President Biden was at the Constitutional Center in Philadelphia talking about these Republican-backed bills that are passing and being proposed in states, saying that they are a broad assault on democracy, that they're un-American and unpatriotic. He blames former President Trump. This movement of these kinds of bills happened after the 2020 presidential election. President Biden today calling it the big lie, former President Trump's unfounded claims of election fraud, and saying that he had the election stolen from him.
There's an unfolding assault taking place in America today, an attempt to suppress and subvert the right to vote and fair and free elections. Bullies and merchants of fear, peddlers of lies, are threatening the very foundation of our country.
President Biden says right now the U.S. is facing its biggest threat to its democracy since the Civil War. The president saying that this threatens U.S. elections integrity. Now, last month, Senate Republicans blocked a sweeping elections reform bill. And right now, as things stand, it's unclear that voting rights bills would get any further in Congress. Joe?
Allison, what about those dozens of Democrats in Washington today? How did they play into what's happening?
Well, as you were talking about, they took charter jets here to D.C. As you mentioned, they're trying to block legislation for the second time now during a special session in Texas. And they've been on the Hill today meeting with Senators Booker and Schumer. They just met with Vice President Kamala Harris. They're trying to put pressure on Congress to do something at the federal level. The governor today saying that he wants them arrested. He wants them brought back so that they are forced to vote in a special session. And the legislature back in Texas voting for the sergeant at arms to go around office to office to see who was there and if they could make an arrest to get any of them to come back to vote.
Isn't that the most un-Texan thing you've ever heard? Texans running from a fight? They're quitters.
And Joe, today I did talk to one of these Texas Democrats who's here in D.C. She told me that people have fought and died for her right to vote. That's why she felt it was important to come here to disrupt her own life, as we talked about. They could be here for weeks, but she felt like this was this big of an issue that she needed to be here to fight for voting rights. She said she didn't want to make it any more difficult in a state where she believes it's already difficult enough for minorities to have access to voting.
Allison Harris in Washington, D.C., starting us off tonight. Allison, thank you very much. We're going to hear now from one of those lawmakers. They're running but not hiding. Texas State Representative Alex Dominguez joins us now. Great to have you with us. Thanks for making time. Do you feel a bit like you're a fugitive, Representative?
No, not at all. Thanks so much for having us here. It's always great to come to D.C. and talk to our colleagues up here as well. So as far as I'm concerned, I am working.
Go ahead, finish. I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
No, we're working up here. We're not just walking around like tourists. We're certainly dressed in a suit, coat and tie. Ladies are all dressed up, and we're talking to legislators here, both in the Congress and in the Senate, speaking with different leaders. I think it's important to meet with stakeholders up here, and at the same time being able to converse with our constituents back home, who, by and large, are very, very supportive of our efforts.
Right. You're not where you're supposed to be, though, and that's why I guess this is garnering so much attention. I hadn't heard the governor's comments there until we just played them, but he's calling this the most un-Texan thing to do and then called you quitters. What's your response to that?
Well, I think I recall another national leader who liked to call people names. He didn't turn out all that great either. But more importantly, I think that the question is, where are we supposed to be? We're supposed to be exactly where we're supposed to be right now, and that's helping our constituents, helping Texan voters, making sure that their rights to vote are no longer infringed. And it's a sad thing is that our governor is trying to bully us. First he started doing this a couple of weeks ago when he vetoed the entire funding for the Texas legislature for Democrats and senators. And at the same time, he also was defunding the lives of over 2,000 Texas workers. So if you want to talk about somebody that's doing something un-Texas-like, that's number one right there.
So you and your colleagues had a number of options when it came to this vote. Why did you pick this one, leaving town?
So our first hearing that we had, mind you, we only started the special session this past Thursday. Bills got referred that day. This voting bill that we're talking about was heard starting on Saturday. That special select committee lasted almost 24 hours. I think it was 23 hours and 30 some odd minutes. At the same time, we heard from over 400 witnesses, largely testifying that there was no need for this bill, from experts in the area of voting who said there is no voter fraud in Texas. Our elections are safe, they're secure. And while we try to offer amendments to improve the bill, they were all rejected down party line. So that is not meaningful debate. It's certainly not negotiation of any sort.
Which part of this
is not the Texan way
that you're fighting back and pushing back the hardest against? Is it the voter ID on mail-in?
There are a number of measures that we don't like, but let me give you a couple of examples. For example, Harris County during the COVID crisis developed a 24-hour voting system. It allowed people that are in shift work who have unusual times available to them to vote. They were able to vote because there was a 24-hour option. Remind everybody that back in the COVID days, we did not want a lot of people congregating. We did not want a lot of people in line. We wanted them to be safe and apart from other people. Remember, 6 feet apart. We saw this in Texas and a number of other states where the blocks were needed to get people to go vote. People lined up 6 feet apart for block after block. And now the governor, knowing that Harris County is now a strong Democratic area, is trying to eliminate the option for Harris County to fund and pay for 24-hour voting. Now, in Texas, we certainly have a number of grocery stores that are open 24 hours. Why can't we have voting for 24 hours? That's a question the governor needs to answer.
The one area that supporters of this reform like to point out is the fact that 37 states, as I found today, have laws requiring voters to show some form of ID at the polls. They say this is not that out of the ordinary.
Well, two things. First, calling this a reform bill is a misnomer. I will not fall into that category of people succumbing to that type of language. Second, in Texas, we already have that requirement. When a person goes to go vote, they have to show a form of ID that is acceptable. And there's a clear list posted on every voting door. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel. Texas already does that.
Yeah, but not with mail-in votes, as I understand it, right? Because explain how that works. If you mail in your ballot right now, your signature is essentially matched in Texas. And I also think, as far as I found today, 1 million people voted by mail in 2020 in Texas last year. Is that correct?
I want to say it might even be a little bit more than that. But more importantly, let's look at states like the state of Washington. I believe the entire state of Washington.
Sure. Oregon
votes
does
by
as
mail.
well. Right.
And
Colorado, yeah.
I'm perfectly happy to emulate whatever system that they have in place.
Right. OK.
So that's my own personal choice. More importantly, when we're talking about mailing ballots, it's not just like everybody's sent a ballot by mail. People have to go through a process of requesting the ballot. And in that process, they have to indicate certain information that only that voter would have. And that's something that our governor is not talking about. We have safeguards already in place.
So was there any indication that there was any fraud of those 1 million mail-in ballots or otherwise in 2020 in Texas?
I want to say that our attorney general is swift to act, according to his own campaign statements. And here we are. The election was, 9 months ago? And not a single person has been charged, arrested, or indicted, or paraded in front of a police station with any charges of fraud for any mail-in ballot. That lets us know that there really was no fraud in Texas.
Right.
Our election was clean, it was fair. Our own Secretary of State at the time, Governor Abbott's appointee, said there was no voter fraud in the state of Texas. The election was fair.
There's one case, as I understand it, Representative, that they're pursuing now, a felon who voted, but apparently didn't realize because he was a felon he wasn't allowed to. So we'll leave that one there. But one other thing before we go, how long do you stay there?
It will be here as long as it's necessary.
30 days?
I packed for 30 days.
And if
necessary.
And if the governor calls another special session after that, you stay?
Well, let's see what we can accomplish here in D.C. first.
All right, Texas State Representative Alex Dominguez, again, we appreciate your time and coming on and talking to us about what's happening in the Lone Star State and also in D.C. as a result. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Our apologies to the viewers there. Had a little bit of a delay, made that a little more difficult than it could have been or should have been. But we'll move on. After Richard Branson's blast off into space this weekend, I'll speak with one CEO who isn't buying it. How much are taxpayers funding these billionaire space odysseys? Always interesting to talk with Dan Price. He'll join us next. And have you seen this yet? Giant goldfish spotted in Minnesota, but how'd they get so big? Are household pets becoming lake monsters? And don't forget, you can follow us on social media at The Donlon Report on Twitter. As the world reopens and Americans get back to traveling, airlines are seeing a major rise in bad behavior on flights. Since January 1st of this year, there have been more than 3,000 reports of unruly passenger behavior. For some perspective, there were just 146 in all of 2019. One recent example, an American Airlines flight crew faced with a woman attempting to open the plane door while in flight, biting a crew member in the process. The crew eventually duct taped her to her seat for the protection of everyone on board. Joining me now, Todd Curtis, Airsafe media founder. Todd, great to have you. What in the world's going on, and why are we seeing so much of this all of a sudden?
Well, there are a lot of things going on, and some of which have to do with numbers that you could point to. For example, the traffic, the people going to fly here in the United States is about the level it was before the pandemic. Let's say 2019, also in July, about the same number of people, but you have fewer flights because a lot of those planes were put on the ground. So all things being equal, things are more crowded. Also, there's a customer service issue. It takes time for the airport and the baggage handlers and the airline and TSA to get the staffing to where it was. So the average experience of a passenger may not be what they recall. Plus, there's all the other stresses that have happened because of this pandemic, which seem to be coming together when people get together to go fly.
Right. This most recent case that we mentioned here, Todd, had to do with a woman having a mental breakdown. But it gives you an indication of some of what these flight crews are having to deal with. How do they prepare for this? How do they train for this?
Well, the flight crews, primarily the cabin crew, because they're the people who are interfacing with the passengers. They are FAA certified professionals. They are authorized to safely help the flight crew conduct that flight. So when people are abusing flight attendants, they're abusing someone who has professional responsibilities, life and death responsibilities. So when you go against them, you fight with them, you bite them, or whatever, they will take command of the situation and do what is appropriate to keep that flight and everyone on it safe.
Yeah, what else is interesting, I think, Todd, is the fact that people on the plane now, passengers, are stepping in, perhaps like they wouldn't have years ago, but now they're not standing for it, and they're helping these flight crews in many cases. What should passengers know before they do this?
Well, this is the kind of thing that you really can't prepare for. Some of your audience might remember from years ago, shortly after 9/11, there was a gentleman who tried to ignite a bomb in his shoe. He was stopped by passengers. A few years later, there was someone who was trying to light an explosive or an incendiary in his underwear. He was stopped by passengers. So it's a sort of thing where you really can't, as a passenger, anticipate. But my suggestion is, if you see something happening, and I'm not saying something where you have to step in, something out of the ordinary, at the very least, make the people on the airplane, especially the flight attendants or the flight crew, aware that something unusual is happening and something should be done.
Right. You mentioned Richard Reed. I thought of him today, the man who tried to blow his shoe up. We make changes as a result of some of these things that happen, Todd. In that case, of course, now, as we all know, we have to take our shoes off when we go through security. We now barricade the cockpit doors. But this door that the person tried to open up in the main area of the plane, it's hard to guard against that, right? That needs to be, I guess, open in some way, not wide open, but obviously accessible.
Well, unfortunately, people behave as they behave, and sometimes they behave in a fashion that can't be predicted. And opening the emergency exit door while on the ground is something that shouldn't be done. Now, without going into detail, it's almost impossible to do so when the airplane is flying, right, because the cabin is pressurized higher than the outside air, and it's hard to open the door in that case. But certainly there have been cases, even before this year, where passengers, either because they were, I don't know, had some sort of event in their mind, or there was something happening outside the plane, that the passenger thought, oh my gosh, this is an emergency, I should open up this door, where it's happened. Now, the general rule of thumb is as follows. Follow the cabin attendants, follow the flight crew. If they say get ready to evacuate, get ready to evacuate. If they don't say that, or if there's nothing that is happening that is obviously an emergency, do not open the door. Don't let anyone else open that door.
All right. Quickly, before we let you go, are the air marshals still flying? I haven't heard much about them.
They are still flying, not on every flight, because there are tens of thousands of flights every day and only a limited number of air marshals. They're typically on flights that have a higher likelihood of having an attack against it, or flying to a destination that might have some things to watch out for. It's the kind of thing where they don't announce ahead of time. Right. They don't even announce afterwards whether or not someone was on it.
Sure.
But rest assured, not only are the air marshals there, you have several layers of security from when you buy the ticket, going through the airport, going past TSA, right, to the cabin attendants who are there to keep things from happening.
Mm-hmm. We should also point out, too, these penalties and fines for the unruly behavior on these planes, they're steep. Tens, in some cases, of thousands of dollars. Todd Curtis, founder of Airsafe Media. Lots of great information in there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Fishing, anyone? They're known for it in Minnesota, of course. Take a look at what they've been catching there lately. Boy, we have a fish story to tell you ahead. Look at that. And protesters take to the streets and highways in Miami to protest the Cuban government's crackdown of protests over the weekend. We're live on the ground in Miami. Coming up. Here's a question. You ever have a goldfish growing up, or maybe your kids? Those little fish can be very cute, especially in a fish bowl on the desk. But what about one of these? Believe it or not, this was once one of those small goldfish. No way it fits in a fish bowl today, that's for sure. Officials in the city of Burnsville, Minnesota, are pleading with people not to release their unwanted pet goldfish into lakes and ponds because they keep growing, as you can see, all the way to 4 pounds and up, more than a foot long. This thing looks like a football. Isaiah Tolo is an expert on goldfish. There are such experts. In fact, we looked long and far and wide for one today, and we found Isaiah, who's also a Fish Health Supervisor for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. So, Isaiah, I mean, the takeaway from this thing is, first of all, I didn't know goldfish could get that big.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that people don't really realize about goldfish is that they can live as long as, your pet dog. We get them in a pet store. I think you can keep them in your house in a small apartment, but that's actually not the case. They can grow pretty big. And the same thing is for ornamental koi as well.
So people think that they're helping the fish, I'm sure, by releasing them into a pond. Maybe they're going to give them a great life. And that may be well-intentioned, but it's not good for a number of reasons. Explain.
So this is a classic example of an aquatic invasive species. So any invasive species is a species that's introduced by humans and causes some sort of economic or environmental issue. It's not usually ill-intentioned, but sometimes when we release species that come from a different part of the world into our environments that we have at our doorstep, they have unintended consequences. And in the case of goldfish, they can have different environmental impacts. They can outcompete native fish for their food sources. They can uproot aquatic vegetation. And another thing they can do is potentially introduce pathogens into these systems that we're trying to protect.
Yeah, I was wondering how they multiply, I guess we'll put it. You need other goldfish, I guess, for this, right? I hate to ask such a crazy question.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, I just found out that they've pulled like 30,000 of them out of a lake in one day up there.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you do need to have multiple goldfish, but another thing to consider is that goldfish can actually hybridize with another invasive species called common carp. And so this is something that we're concerned about as well, as not only the natural reproduction of goldfish in these systems, which they can do, they can reproduce with other goldfish, and they're broadcast spawners. So some of them will hold millions of eggs at a time. So from just a couple of goldfish, you can go to having thousands of them and really having a really serious problem, not to mention hybridization with other invasive fish.
And they don't just hang out in the pond where you drop them, right? This is another problem. They can work their way through the water systems.
Yeah, and this is one of the major concerns that we would have with introduction of invasive species is that they can then become established, and then it's almost impossible to remove them from a system.
Yeah, well, who knew when we gathered around a shoebox in the backyard to bury Finn years ago, had a hard time keeping the fish alive, usually from these carnival fish, for just a week or two, as it seems. But now we know, do not release them into ponds. What should people do with them before we let you go, Isaiah?
So if you have a goldfish and you don't want to keep it any longer, then there is the possibility of having a vet come and euthanize it for you, which is a little bit distasteful. But also you can donate it to a friend, or you can even give it back to a local pet shop if you can't keep that fish any longer yourself. All right,
Isaiah Tolo, Fish Health Supervisor at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Thanks for the lesson today, Isaiah. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Pro-democracy protests are continuing to fill the streets of South Florida as Cuban Americans rally for their loved ones across the Gulf. Can the U.S. help deliver democracy to the communist nation? We'll discuss ahead. Plus, renewed demonstrations in the U.S. today in support of protesters in Cuba calling for food, medicine, and most of all, freedom. Joining me now with more from Miami, News Nation's Brian N. Brian, what's the latest?
Yeah, Joe, these demonstrations and protests are popping up really throughout the entire state of Florida. Take a look. We're at a park in Miami. There's at least a couple of hundred people out here right now demonstrating. The biggest protest at the moment is happening on the Palmetto Expressway. That is a major highway that runs right through South Florida, about 8 lanes across. Cuban-American protesters shut that highway down, and it has been closed for the last 6 hours or so during rush hour. The protesters on the highway say they want to send a message straight to President Biden. They want the United States to intervene in this crisis in Cuba. They want the dictatorship gone, and they finally want democracy there. Over the last day or so, the Cuban government has been using Russian and Chinese equipment to shut down internet and phone lines on the island. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis spoke about that earlier today. He believes the U.S. government should help restore internet in Cuba. Listen to what the governor said.
What does the regime do when you start to see these images? They shut down the internet. They don't want the truth to be out. They don't want people to be able to communicate. And so one of the things I think we should be able to do with our private companies or with the United States is to provide some of that internet service via satellite. We have companies on the Space Coast that launch these things.
Something else interesting that's been happening over the last 24 hours, there are Cuban Americans on boats that are trying to make the journey to Cuba with food, supplies, and medicine going straight across the Florida Straits. The U.S. Coast Guard put out a warning today telling them not to do it, that it is too dangerous, and it's totally unpredictable what the Cuban Coast Guard will do if these boats get too close to the island. Joe?
Brian, we mentioned how it's gone dark there with the internet down and phone service as well. Have you been able to talk to anyone there who has family or relatives in Cuba who can tell us what's happening there right now?
That's the scary thing. Most people here have no idea what is happening on the island because of the blackout with the internet and phone lines. I spoke to one family that was able to briefly get through this morning, obviously relieved to hear that their relatives were at least okay and able to answer the phone. But besides that, everyone else telling us that they've had no way of getting through, and there have been very, very few videos coming out on social media throughout the day. Joe?
All right, News Nation's Brian Enton, thank you very much for that live update for us tonight from Miami. Let's bring in Leland Vitter right now to get more on the situation there. And I think this is something we talked about the other day, Leland, is this concern of not knowing what's happening there. And now we have the internet down. We're not sure what's happening.
Well, in sort of a perverse way, as terrible as it is to stifle free speech and free expression, putting the news out, the Cuban government has done the Biden administration an enormous favor. We have a couple of the videos that came out over the weekend of the protests inside of Cuba before the internet was shut down. But what we don't have is any videos of what's happening today. Conceivably, they could be using extraordinarily repressive and aggressive means to beat and to imprison protesters. And that's certainly what the Cuban government's done. That's certainly what the Russians do and the Chinese who train the Cubans do. But we can't see it. And the very fact of the matter is that we're sitting here right now. We're not talking about the horrors on the streets of Havana. We're talking about protests in downtown Miami. If these videos continue to come out, it would force the Biden administration's hand in a way that so far it's not being forced. And there's a parallel here with the same playbook. 2009, there was the Iranian Green Revolution. That was in the very beginning parts of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration did basically the same thing the Biden administration did. They are sort of putting out milquetoast statements about international norms and universal rights, really avoided going directly after the Iranian regime. Same way the Biden administration is not really going after the Castro regime. Within a couple of days, the Iranians shut down the internet. It disappeared from the front pages. The Iranian regime is still in power now, almost 10 years later, 9 years later. Very similar playbook to what we are seeing right now out of Cuba. Who is one of the big Cuban allies involved in this that advises the Cubans? The Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians.
So what are the U.S. options here? The Cubans are asking the U.S. for help.
Well, and you heard that from Brian's report. Do something, intervene in some way. That's easy to say, intervene in some way. More importantly, the next question is, do what? How do you intervene? This is the Miami mayor, and here were his thoughts.
President Clinton in Kosovo, intervening in a humanitarian issue with airstrikes. So there have been many, many opportunities in the history.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table.
Wow. And you think about that, the implications of that. Starting a war in Cuba is starting a war effectively with both the Russians and the Chinese. And next, you'd sort of step back and say, okay, what about a naval blockade? Well, when there's Russian ships headed there, do you shoot at them? When there's Russian planes or Iranian planes headed to Cuba, do you shoot them down or not? Things can escalate extraordinarily quickly. You're seeing video of what happened on the streets of Havana. Things escalated there very quickly. You can see the tactics that the Cuban regime is willing to use against its own people, you can just imagine what would happen if the United States started, shall we say, intervening in a more formal way.
I guess the bigger question, too, as to what's happening there, which is unfortunate that we don't know. We asked the question yesterday, can the people there who are protesting survive this? And this turns on the possibility of a civil war and what happens with the military in Cuba if that does happen.
Well, no question that the regime there has done an excellent job controlling the military. And top to bottom, they have the military very well buttoned down. This isn't Libya where you have different tribes and parts of the military would break away. It's also not like Egypt where the military government is separate from really the civilian government. This is all one and the same. You've got Russian, Venezuelan, and Chinese and Iranian advisors inside. And remember this, you talk about a population. There is no Second Amendment in Cuba.
Sure.
Okay, so the population doesn't have weapons. For 65 years, the communist regime has taken weapons out of the hands of every civilian. So the only people who have guns are the police, who are now on the streets, and as we've seen in video, unfortunately, more than happy to use them against peaceful protesters.
We will continue to keep an eye on it. Leland Vittert, thank you very much for the update.
Good to see you.
Don't forget, you can tune in to On Balance with Leland
there I am.
Next week. There he is. Right after our show, 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 Central. How much hair product is in there?
Oh,
lot?
Trade secret.
We're going to take a break. After Richard Branson's blast off into space this weekend, I'll speak with one CEO who isn't buying it. How much are taxpayers funding these billionaire space odysseys? We'll talk with Dan Price. He went out of his way to join us, and he'll do that next. We're back with a quick update to our lead story tonight. The Texas Senate has passed the GOP-led voting reform bill. Democrats from the lower chamber, the House, of course, are in Washington, D.C., as we explained, trying to avoid a vote. In the Senate, though, it was a party line vote. Texas Governor Greg Abbott has threatened to arrest the fleeing Democrats in the House who have said they are indeed on borrowed time, and they realize it. Now, let's go to space. Richard Branson became the first billionaire to make it to Space Sunday, making him the winner of the so-called billionaire space race. Not everyone's celebrating, though. Gravity Payments CEO Dan Price points out the government already went to space 60 years ago. So what's the big deal about going now, Branson and Bezos, and at what cost? Joining me now is Dan Price, who actually drove 15 minutes for us to find a better Wi-Fi spot so he could join us. We appreciate that commitment and that dedication, Dan. It's always fun to talk with you. I love your Twitter feed because it gives us a lot to think about when it comes to financial wealth, inequities, and income of that sort. So let's start with this billionaire space race. You had a field day with this. Here was your tweet today. Richard Branson, worth $5.3 billion, got $220 million from taxpayers in New Mexico, one of the poorest states, to start a space travel business that 0.02% of the population can afford tickets for.
Yeah, I mean, it's all right there, right? What we have is billionaires relying on government subsidies, avoiding taxes in a huge way that's really like a secondary subsidy, and transferring wealth and power from regular people out there, from workers to themselves, and using that power to perform these little tricks. Jeff Bezos himself said that the most important reason why he went to space was because he had so much money, he had nothing to spend it on. This at a time when he's union busting to avoid paying people a living wage, a wage that they can just get by on. And so, you know, it's not a surprise that people are seeing that and reacting and realizing how terrible it is.
I'll get to Bezos in a minute, Dan, but let's go back to this spaceport, because I saw today that 25% of what that county there in New Mexico collects from spaceport goes to STEM outreach in public schools. And local governments here are essentially betting on this paying off down the road. You see that, right?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and I do think that's a good point that we should talk about, because whenever we talk about community investments that really pay back, science-based community investments, things like universal pre-K, making sure kids are not going hungry, making sure that they have the support outside of school hours, these are things that pay back in spades. And whenever it's a social program that pays off for regular people, we scream socialist. But if it's one of those programs that has some kind of unknown return on investment that just happens to also benefit billionaires, you know, then we say, oh, that makes sense. And so there's a little bit of a double standard there that we're dealing with.
let's talk about the food issue, Dan, because I did flag one of your earlier tweets that pointed out that in the pandemic, the world added a record 118 million people who are chronically hungry, and global billionaires added a record $4 trillion to their wealth. The cost to end world hunger, $330 billion, is what billionaires made in 1 month. And instead, they're going to space.
Yeah, well, you heard, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you would hear this line like, well, you can tax everything from the ultra wealthy, and it doesn't really provide enough to make the kind of changes that you want to. But that, because wealth inequality has gotten so out of hand and the billionaires have gotten so rich so quickly, that's not true anymore, not even close to true. And so we do need to look at solutions to figure out how to tax these billionaires, how to make sure they pay their fair share. But of course, the system is set up to elevate people like them and to benefit people like them at the cost of everybody else. If we went back to the system we had, for example, in the 1950s and the 1960s, back then, the average income would double every 10, 15 years, the median income, and the billionaires, or at least the ultra wealthy at that time, would pay an effective tax rate of 50%, and we wouldn't give them so many of these subsidies.
I do want to just
really
point out,
rigged the game for them.
Point out, Dan, that Bezos donated $10 billion to Earth Fund and $100 million to Feeding America. Your point is well taken. I want to leave that there for now because I do want to get you on another tweet that we saw too, talking about the leverage that employees are now enjoying, which has not been the case. Employers typically have enjoyed that leverage because people want the job or need the job. But now you have companies like McDonald's offering these really enticing incentives. You have Burger King. I'm not sure if you saw where there were workers at a store who put up a sign on the door and said they quit because of the working conditions, optimistic that they're going to see something better. So this is a change, but at the same time, and I know you've talked about this, companies are shifting now to automation and using these claims to change the way they do business that may not be helpful to the worker.
Well, you're hearing all this, rigmarole about labor shortage, and I do think workers are reevaluating what type of working conditions are required for them to show up and be productive, and they're realizing it's not healthy to be put through the working conditions that we put your typical worker through at the pay that we put them through. And so when it's hazardous to your health, not showing up is a good move. And if we all do that together, then we have a little bit of leverage. Workers have a little bit of leverage to basically say, if you want my labor, which you're absolutely dependent on, it's workers that make employees successful. You got to come to the table with some better working conditions and some better pay. And the irony is, in the end, that'll make the economy healthier for everybody, including the people at the top.
Well, it's always, again, as I said, interesting to follow your feed and follow the debates among your 500,000 followers or so who enjoy listening to it as well. And we love having you on the show. Dan Price, CEO of Gravity Payments and author of Worth It. Thanks for going the extra mile to get that Wi-Fi coverage too, Dan. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Where you assume things that are not true. When you just mentioned, blowing these teams out, that's never happened. So I don't know where you get that. So, can I finish?
No, I mean,
can I finish?
You're saying that's not true. Your average margin.
Can I finish my statement?
Your average margin.
Are you going to let me finish my statement or not? So you'll be quiet now while I talk, and then I'll listen to you.
No one certainly confusing this year's squad with the 92 Dream Team, what many consider the greatest basketball team ever assembled, featuring Hall of Famers Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Scottie Pippen, and arguably the greatest basketball player of all time, Michael Jordan. But the 2021 team, still led by All-Stars Damian Lillard and former MVP Kevin Durant. Team USA has only lost 4 times since the 92 Dream Team and is looking to win its 4th consecutive Olympic gold at this year's games. For more on the team, I'm joined now by Brandon Scoop B. Robinson of the Bally Sports Network. All right, Scoop, you can't win them all unless you're USA basketball, and then you're supposed to, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, but I'll add this. When you look at the 2 losses that Team USA had, this is coming off of, some of these guys playing in the NBA playoffs and only having 2 games of practice together or 2 days of practice. You look at Australia, you look at Nigeria, right. Some of those guys have practiced 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Are
they missing players now, right? They're still waiting for some who will join. But do you think, Scoop, this team's built to go for the gold? I mean, have they gone for too many shooters, not enough bigs?
Well, I think it's still built, but I think that this is a reminder that you can't just throw guys together on a roster and hope to perform unless you're LeBron James teaming up on the Lakers, the Heat, the Cavs, or what have you. But they've caught up. I saw in the segue you mentioned Dream Team. They beat Angola. They beat some of those other teams. Those guys were fans of them. Now, some international guys have caught up. The defenses have caught up, and the star power is there.
Right. So a lot of our best decide not to play. You're saying that we maybe shouldn't expect to dominate without them, and that other basketball's catching up.
I think guys are catching up, as you saw in the 2004 Olympics, where the USA got the bronze medal. They've since revamped it. You see Greg Popovich coaching Team USA. It was handed over by Coach K over at Duke. But I think it's just going to take some time to develop for those guys. James Harden of the Brooklyn Nets has sat out, and others as well.
Hey, Scoop, we just have 30 seconds left, but I want to get you on baseball. The All-Star game is tonight. What do you think of all of these rules changes that they're talking about to improve or make the game more exciting?
I think they're trying to make it more exciting. I will tell you the home run derby last night was great. Hope to see a good showing from the AL and the NL tonight.
Yeah, all right. There's a lot in the mix. I know even robot umpires, perhaps, they're testing out in the minor leagues. We'll see where that goes. Bigger bases, too. Hey, Brandon, Scoop B. Robinson of the Bally Sports Network. It's always good to see you, my friend.
Don, I'll see you soon. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care. That's it for our time for now. Marnie and Rob are next with News Nation Prime. Have a great evening.